Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and share some of the things I'm trying to think through. I'm also, I'm going to repeat myself. I said this to you before, Maya, but I'm really excited about this format in general. I think it's amazing. And yeah, I love this idea of, creative pedagogy. I think it's very important, and I'm grateful to be part of it. And yeah, also, Tina, to you, thank you for all the behind the scenes work or labor, work and labor. And yeah, so for what I'm going to do in the following, I'm taking seriously what you, Maya, have told me, which was try to dig deep instead of range wide. I will probably do both. I need to do both, and also you said don't make it too polished. So this is really, yeah, somehow work in progress, or like stuff I'm thinking through. It's not very, it's not finished or anything, what is ever, I don't know, yeah. All right, so since this is about the dictionary and about AI, I will eventually today be talking about one specific cybernetic principle that is fundamental to artificial intelligence, as in, deep learning algorithms and machine learning algorithms and so on, which is feedback. If we think of artificial intelligence and, all the problems that we see with it today, so we're thinking bias, for example, we're thinking an all-encompassing determination of life in a way, because we're also thinking unjust systems which have been subsumed by capital, right? So if we think of AI and these problems, we also have to think about, what Maya already said, specific histories that inform these ideas, and that not only inform these ideas, but how artificial intelligence is applied and operates today. So the problem of bias and the myth of, neutral technology fundamentally has to do with feedback. So think of the typical cybernetic black box model, if you will. If you put in something that is, for example, if you put in racism will be put out, right? So in machine learning algorithms, for example, that need to be trained, in most
Nelly, I think you muted yourself.
Nelly, we can't hear you. There was some sound just now.
Could be that, she has a little baby. So
we can hear sound now.
Yeah, I'm changing my network.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Only be like 10 seconds.
No problem. I thought maybe you had a baby that you had to go attend to.
My baby's not a baby anymore. All right. I mean, yeah. So you hear me, you see me. Yeah?
Yes.
I changed the network. It should be fine.
Thanks.
All right. So should I go back a bit?
It's up to you.
It's fine, just where you were, just the last thing that you said.
All right. So I was talking about, well, algorithms and feedback. And so for today, what I want to do is I'm going to look at feedback, and I will do it by means of the episteme and the operation of feedback. And I will bring it into conversation with Édouard Glissant's work, which is basically the framework of my project in general. I will explain what that means later. So a few words on cybernetics. I use cybernetics a lot as a meta science, right? Which means that it offers language for me, both like the vocabulary, but also a framework that lets me communicate things I'm trying to think through. Because I can describe specific similarities or structural similarities of systems, for example. I can recognize patterns and so on and so forth. So if we think of feedback loops in cybernetics, they are important in many different systems, right? So they're important for machines, for electrical circuits, computer coding, statistical analysis, but also, economic processes, and then actually any kind of system, also be it ecological, biological, and so on. And so feedback is essentially important to control a system, first and foremost. Hello. Thanks for joining. So there will be a defined goal for the system. And in order to reach that goal, feedback loops are introduced to correct and adjust the system, right? There are different states of feedback that cause different reactions in and off the system. So for example, feedback in a control system will mean that the system shows less sensitivity to the unwanted internal and external disturbances. And then depending on the system, if you think of cybernetics as the science of feedback and information that travels from a system through its environment and then back to the system, it depends if you think of, a system that is the economy, or if you think of a system that is, a thermometer, like a thermodynamical system, for example. All right, so this is just to kind of set the scene a little bit. Hello, welcome. And I'm now traveling to Édouard Glissant. Hi. And I did a bit of an introduction on algorithms and feedback because I'm interested for today, since this is about AI in the term of feedback. So I'm going to Glissant now, and I will start off by actually ranging wide, as I said, in order to then dig deep. I think that it's important to provide a bit of context what I'm doing in my project in general, so you can actually, have an entrance into why I think Glissant is necessary at all to think of some of these things. So I'm actually interested in relations. I'm interested in their modes, their movements, and their immaterialities. How we relate, I think, to each other, to anything, be it living, be it dead, be it material or not, be it a structure or system, be it the world, is dependent on media and technology. Their history, of course, has always been intimately intertwined with thinking race, or like racial thinking. And I'm thinking race as a social relation in this case, right? So it might be surprising to some, but my point of departure for this project, for the dissertation project, is neither from seminal media theoretical work, although of course I'm engaging with it, nor from this kind of research on, for example, race and racism, critical race theory, or any kind of other theory in that direction. The point of entry, passage, departure, and re-entry is the life work of Martinian poet, novelist, and philosopher Édouard Glissant. His commitment to a poetics and poetic knowledge, his writing and counter-conceptualizing, words at play, so to say, bear a certain medial technicity and thus enable a confluence of cybernetic epistemologies and imaginaries, which, as I kind of said in the beginning, are, also determining of the contemporary condition, with, let's say, other places, different geographies, positions, and especially experiences. So I'm situating or bringing his work in relation with cybernetics, the epistemologies, and think that, they can be related to computational realities in contemporary politics. Which is to say, I'm arguing that Glissant is vital for media thinking, for thinking media and mediated thinking. In my project, or my project in general, is naturally structured through the archipelago as a site and as a principle for my geographical references first. So for this talk, important would be Martinique, Haiti, and Japan. And as in principle, because it also constitutes diffracted places that constitute a history and a narration within this project. So Martinique, for example, is important because it's Édouard Glissant's birthplace, and the Antilles in general, the Caribbean Sea, and how they relate to the world is one of Glissant's themes, like general themes in his work always from the beginning. And it converges in his concept of creolization. It is actually present in everything that he is trying to think through. Japan, on the other hand, and this is just a very, miniature excursus, just that you get an idea of my work in general, as I said, is important because in one of Glissant's seminal work, Poétique de la Relation, which was published in 1990 in the original language French, Glissant is writing about a Japanese computer company that is invested in studying different African oral languages in order to create a new machinic language. And so remember, the book was published in 1990. And it's a very short paragraph, but what I'm doing in my project is I'm trying to reconstruct this project. So especially its outcomes or also non-outcomes. I mean, it depends on what I'm finding, of course, but I'm doing somewhat investigative work, which means I need to pin down the company, when it was, where it was exactly, and, you know, everything around that. And by virtue of doing that, I'm actually, you know, or by virtue of tracing all of these networks and constellations that Glissant was part of, I'm also tracing how he informed all of this at the same time. For example, to give you an example, so Glissant in the 80s was the editor-in-chief of the UNESCO Courier. And in 1983, he was responsible for an issue on communication, which was heavily influenced by not only Japanese scholars, but also by Japanese ideas on information technology. And this is an amazing issue. Like you can find it online, and you know, it was 1983, and they were there are like articles and there are texts in there that speak of the computer as the universal machine and bring it into conversation with many, many, many more geographies than we think of today when we think of the history of cybernetics, for example. So, you know, this kind of chapter is really a question foremost of what these histories are and where they carry me in the first place. And so this is from one archipelago to another, right? So I'm really trying to reconnect or like rewire and switching up these actors and, you know, those in power that narrate the stories that become then our histories. Yeah, and I also think, you know, it's quite important to always be reflexive also about the fact that such work, such rewiring always already tells a lot about, you know, the time and the place and the space from where it stands. So it tells a lot about me and what I think about the contemporary condition, of course. So before now I return to a different island in the Caribbean, I will try to provide a gateway into Glissant's work, how and why I'm reading it in these contexts. So this is, again, a small segment of many more interrelated terms I'm working with. But for this purpose, we're now at the point where I'm trying to narrow it down. So because Glissant builds the frame of my work, so his language, which is a certain glossary that provides a certain glossary for me, it enables me to think through these specific time spaces and settings and thus histories. His thinking, I and many others would say, always operated within 3 dimensions, which are space, time, and language, so nothing too shocking yet. It also, it has also always been in conversation with Western thought. So Glissant would say the operating mode of Western thought could be identified as systematic. So Western thinking builds on and operates on thought systems. Glissant explains that this kind of operation refuses any contact or relation with and to the real. So that means the reality of the world. He says they no longer provide understanding or means to assess what is happening in the real. One of the reasons he's saying this is something that he drew from chaos theory at the time, specifically the notion of the erratic deterministic system, which is a notion from chaos theory. He actually conceptualizes the world totality. He would call it the whole world, the tout monde, through systems thinking. And by means of the erratic, he assesses the system. So this erratic dimension as a dimension of these systems with multiple variables has become the dimension of the whole world, which means it has become unpredictable. So as someone who actually produces a lot of neologisms, which Glissant did, so he actually established his own kind of glossary as well, he will speak throughout his work of 3 specific relations between all things in the world, which appear threefold. That's redundant. So it's the tout monde, the world in its entirety. It's the echo monde, the world of things resonating with each other or one another. And chaos monde, a world that cannot be systemized. So the latter is the dimension of uncertainty and unpredictability, which we could call today the incomputable. So Édouard Glissant has always been thinking from the shoreline, you could say, because all that was before is lost in the abyss of the middle passage. So Glissant was a descendant of enslaved people that, you know, at a certain point arrived in Martinique, and all his thinking is reflective upon what it means to be a subject of non-history. In the opening chapter of Poétique de la Relation, he's describing and tracing the horrors of this violent and dark voyage. The chapter is called The Open Boat, and it actually manifests Glissant's unusual perspective on this moment in time. Someone who has worked a lot with the evolutionary qualities, you could say, of Glissant's thought is Kojo Shun. And I'm also interested in these evolutionary qualities. And here I'm also interested in what has been generated by this experience. That was a systematic operation, that is the transatlantic slave trade and the maintenance of the plantation system. So in this chapter, The Open Boat, Glissant is contrasting the belly of the boat, which is the horror, which is, you know, absolute abyss darkness, with the open boat. So the belly of the boat with the open boat, and the boat that still had a direction. And I'm not saying this from the perspective of the ones that steered the Cubanese, but I'm saying it from the perspective of those cramped in this darkness, who were not considered, you know, fully human, who were mere flesh, commodity, and readable data. And, you know, this open boat, it still led somewhere. And from there, Glissant is able to imagine the whole world. So this kind of interest in movement, and this movement by Glissant himself, is what is interesting to me. So I'm finally now arriving at another island and a historical scene. At the turn of the 18th century, from 1791 to 1804, the Haitian Revolution took place. It became a source and a narrative of emancipation and resistance, of the struggle for liberation and freedom, but in particular an alternative history that underpinned the Western paradox of the time. It consists in the simultaneity of proclaiming the values of liberté, égalité, and fraternité, that is, of constructing a narrative of free and enlightened man, while across the seas and lands for centuries, and at that very time, the cruel and systematic enterprise of mass enslavement of non-European people was maintained. In 1789, the year of the French Revolution, Saint-Domingue was the largest producer of sugar and coffee. Just 2 years later, on August 21st, 1791, the enslaved and desert people of the island would launch a rebellion, eventually proclaiming in 1804 the first liberated nation of people of African descent outside of Africa, Haiti. In 2018, historian Julius Scott published an unprecedented account of this time, this era of revolution, which is called The Common Wind: Afro-American Currents in the Age of the Haitian Revolution. It is the title of a really masterful, brilliant book that tells us about the secret communication networks of the Haitian Revolution. And it is evidence of and revives the secret exchange of information among enslaved people, and questions how that information moved between geographies and people who had neither rights to nor any kind of access to information that enabled them to actually rebel, right? So the answer I'm going to provide in and for that scope today, and for this talk, is feedback. So within the control of communication, a control that was incumbent upon the colonial system, this common wind caused a disruption. It caused a disturbance of a system that was not accounted for, could not be predicted in the algorithms of the ruling, of the masters in the machine. It was a disturbance of a field which not only brought its mediality to light, but which was also necessary in order to identify places of enabling within this very mediality. So enabling itself arises from the movement of information and rumors, of people and ships, of vegetations and goods, of the feedback between them. Édouard Glissant describes planetary forces, the oceans, the wind, the forests, and he writes of cultural forces, creolization, relation, and opacity, among many others. But above all, he also writes of the mobility of all of these forces, of their relations and immaterialities, their feedbacks. So to think about, this kind of history and also about the plantation system and everything that fed into it means to think about extraction of, labor, resources, and data. So which brings me to critically place feedback within this whole setting. It is, of course, possible on many different levels. It draws me towards very different relations where feedback is an operating factor, because in the beginning, as you know, I said I'm interested in relations. And I think they're also here those that will give me the opportunity to rewrite these histories, right? So within the system of the world, then, we're talking the relation between periphery and metropole during that time. Within the system of commerce, that was the main factor for information travel, because the ships were moving from, Europe to the Caribbean islands, for example. We're talking relations between geographies, but we're also talking relations between those who were meant to be subjects and fully human and those who were not, those who were the masterless. And within the system of communication, we're talking relations between information, rumor, and atmosphere. So within the larger scope of my project, I'm going through, very many different terms and rethink them through these histories. But for the scope of today, I'm questioning what it actually means for feedback, or what does feedback mean under conditions of increased uncertainty? How do they relate to each other, and how does that change our understanding of a given system in the first place? So this will also touch upon a question about the reactivity of certain histories. How do they alter their behavior, if I can make them subject? And what do they show us if they know they're being observed? So this also goes back to what I said in the beginning, that it tells a lot about, of course, my perspective on the current technical or condition of technical life, that I'm interested in these specific histories and bring them into conversation with media theory in the widest sense. So also, I'm thinking here epistemic feedback, of course. So changing the mode of operation, which already starts with a point of view, how we think of cybernetics today. And lastly, also in terms of epistemology, I'm thinking of reflexivity. So how, or reflexivity that refers to circular relationships between cause and effect, which goes back to feedback as well. And that is especially embedded in human belief structures, but also conditions and informs how we think these histories. So thank you for listening. And I'm happy to get into conversation. I didn't make it to, as I said, it's in progress, but also to not make it too complicated. I think this is a good start for, conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelly. Since some people came later, I just quickly repeat that you're most welcome to ask questions or make comments in the chat, but you're also most welcome to just speak, like unmute yourself and ask questions. If there's people asking questions at the same time, we will make a little speaking order if necessary.
And I guess people can raise their hands if they want to speak, or
Yes. You can also ask questions about the AI dictionary if you like, or like both is possible.
Hi, I would actually like to ask something. Hi, Nelly. It was really nice to hear you. I'm Auli, I'm from Estonia, and I study semiotics, basically, so I'm a PhD student. And well, cybernetics and feedback loops is something that has recently come up in semiotics also, especially in the work of one of my colleagues. Who tries to sort of mix it, but yeah, generally it seems to me also that like this Soviet semiotics as of origin had some influences and connections with cybernetics as well. And I was wondering if you know any of it, or like I mean, I quickly checked that Édouard Glissant is not very known or cited among the French semiotics, but like, have you heard of it? Do you think it would be useful to know semiotic approaches also?
So I'm asking back a question. So you mean semiotics, so the relationship of semiotics and cybernetics in the Soviet context?
Maybe also, like, I was just wondering also, like, if you just know any connections between Glissant and semiotics, or
Okay.
generally, because like in terms of okay, I'm not very good at explaining it. Yeah, well, feedbacks. Okay, I will just throw another thought also in regarding yeah, because when you mentioned that Glissant sort of saw all this I don't know, the epistemologies of the world coming from outside as denying the connection with reality, then this is something that also strikes me with semiotics, especially from Charles Peirce, who also kind of has this logic-based approach, which basically denies the final contact with the reality, that we can always like get closer to it, but never to it. And yeah, I was also like, this is the second point, like if you have any comments on that.
So yeah, Glissant and semiotics, it's a good question. So, you know, like how Glissant starts his thinking. So he was a poet as well, right? He was a novelist. And so everything he did, the first book he published, for example, was a collection of poetry in the late 40s. And so everything he did actually, and he thought through, started from language, right? So, but I'm not really sure if I can like speak informed about his connection to semiotics. I'm not sure if so yeah, there's one book that's like hovering in my mind. If I remember the title, I will say, but I'm not sure if I can, you know, speak informed about his connection to semiotics, or we would have to go like dig a bit deeper into like, yeah, a bit more of a specific, I don't know. But to the second question, that sounds interesting, this logic approach, as you said, and yeah, that we can never really reach the reality. I think for Glissant, I mean, how he conceptualized this, it's a bit, you know, it reminds me sometimes, and also now in terms, or like in relation to the question, it reminds me of something that Ashim Mbembe said in an interview not too long ago. And I think that this is touching upon how Glissant also meant it. So he said that obviously, you know, for a while, there was an established power relation in the world. But at some point, obviously, terms or like paradigms and everything were shifting. And so as long as we deny this, and as long, for example, to now also, you know, pin it down on this kind of systematic thought that he was mentioning, he would say that systematic thought calls for predicting a future. And, you know, this is interesting to me in terms of, if you think it from like a media theoretical approach, what he's saying, and in already the 50s, he's like foreclosing that we get in trouble actually with the conception of time and temporalities as soon as we hit, or as soon as, you know, the digital takes over as, you know, the dominant media theoretical structure. And so I think this is important in this respect. So I don't think that he would say we can never be in touch with reality. He has a very strong aspect of thinking materiality with everything he thinks. So I don't think that this is that he would say, you know, since there's only language and signs and so on, we can never be really in touch. But he says that in this structure of established, you know, powers and dominance, we will have to shift, and we will have to acknowledge that, for example, and these processes were never you know, harmonious. They were heterogeneous. They would come with conflict and all of these things. But he would say we have to make a habit and kind of get used to the fact that we now live in a world system, or like the two monde, that will always be the chaos monde. So it will always be unpredictable in certain instances, right? So when he, for example, conceptualizes creolization, during the time it was necessary for him to actually engage with certain discussions on, for example, hybridity, right? Or, well, mixture and all of these terms that were kind of like virulent at the time, because he would say, you know, creolization doesn't mean that you have a part and have another part and then you can predict what is the outcome. It's exactly what it not is. Creolization is a very chaotic and unpredictable process because all of these things, and then he would go into all of these different factors. And so I think, yeah, as for Glissant, and to come back to what I said in the beginning about Achille Mbembe said something in the interview. It was about this movement of my curriculum is white. And he's repeatedly asked, but how does it actually, like, why is this important to the country we're in? And it was in Norway. He gave the interview to a Norwegian magazine. And like, he's repeatedly asked, because, you know, the interviewer is kind of insinuating, okay, we don't have a real colonial history, so why do we have to decolonize the curriculum? And then Achille Mbembe says something like, well, if you teach your students at university, wouldn't you want them to be in contact with the world? And so the world is not only, you know, Norway, it's also not only Western thought, it's also not only, and then he like goes from there and so on and so forth. And I think that this is something Glissant implicitly and explicitly carries throughout his work. It's that he says we have to get in contact with all of the world. This will be very conflictual, but it will be the less violent well, way or trajectory than, you know, going back to this notion of well, the nation and this single root history where people draw a certain kind of legitimacy from to be somewhere on a land and then, you know, go into nationalisms and so on and so forth. He would say we have to get in contact with the world and the like movements that are present in the world. And these are unpredictable. But if we kind of embrace the fact that we cannot predict the future, maybe, and then he goes from there, you know. But this is something that is, to me, quite interesting and was quite early. You know, he started this already in the 50s, 60s. To say about the world where we now have to deal with a, you know, media structure and infrastructure that basically determines the future every day and every second and so on and so forth, and changes temporalities fundamentally. Sorry, very long answer. Yeah, but thank you for the question. Sorry that I can't answer the first one. Well,
thank you. It was very interesting.
Don't be sorry, Nelly, that was great. I can see that Ranjot, you're raising your hand. Would you like to ask something?
Yes, I'm not really confident about my internet, so let's see if the video actually works. It does, something works. Hi, thank you so much, Nelly. That was fantastic. I have a couple of questions, but you know, for the sake of order, I'll only ask one, and a really pressing one that I have, which has to do with sort of history and periodization in the way you're thinking. So you mentioned how you want to think about the feedback, and you reach out to Glissant in order to do that. And similarly, your examples, I mean, your departure point in some ways, and correct me if I'm wrong here, to me seems like the present moment. You talked about sort of uncertainty vis-a-vis feedback, whereas Glissant is drawing upon a different historical time period and is also writing in a slightly distinct time period. So I'm wondering if you could reconcile to me what seem like three moments, right? The moment where a certain kind of uncertainty exists during maybe the heyday of slave trade, heyday of sort of colonialism. Then there is Glissant looking back at that. And then Glissant is also looking back at like 1,000 other time periods. Then there is Glissant's own moment when he is writing and birthing these really fantastic theories. And then there is the present where you're writing and you're also thinking about the present. And I'm wondering, I'm just curious to hear you talk more about how you sort of contend with these historical positions.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic question. So what was hard for me today was to already, kind of integrate that in the talk. I should have done it probably better, because that's why I gave like a little glimpse into the like larger trajectory of my PhD project. Because one of the arguments in my PhD projects is not projects, I don't have many, is that I say that I think Édouard Glissant is pretty vital for thinking or like for media thinking today. And sorry. Yeah, so from there I go. And then from there, what I do first is I establish a certain kind of, that's why I used the word glossary, I think twice. I establish, or like with Glissant, think through certain terms, his terms, first of all, and establish a glossary that I think is productive to think about certain histories. And then from there, I go to these histories and place them within this larger structure. But that means that Glissant, as in the framework for my work, he can only be that because I'm using some of his language, which I then also trace back to these different time periods. It's really a fantastic question. So if I, so yeah, for today, it was really like compressed, but I start with many, not so many, but other terms in my PhD project. So I actually go from Martinique and the subject of non-history, right? And what that means and what that meant for him and his time. And then I place him within, well, the 40s, 50s, 60s in France. And then within the political kind of structure that he was banned from Martinique because of his political and so on and so forth. And then from there, I developed a certain terms I want to work with. And I arrive at some point at his work at the UNESCO Courier, which to me is super interesting because I don't think that many people have written about it, but he produced incredible issues on certain things and worked with specific people. And so from there, I'm tracing these constellations. And then from there, that takes me, for example, to Japan, because Japan is already, present in this like 70s, 80s time. So I'm really also tracing, the relationships he had and so on and so forth. And then that takes me back to the book where he talks about this Japanese computer company. So this is actually the first, that's what I'm starting with, right? And so I already hopefully have established like an architecture of terms that are in conversation with the time he's in at the moment, but also with the history he himself is referring to. So, for example, the subject of non-history can only be read from his specific time and place, right? And I'm starting with that. Okay, so, and then because he provides this glossary, or I'm arguing that he is, you know, vital for media thinking, whatever that means, but because I'm establishing, or like I'm trying to build this glossary with which I think it would be very much more productive to think through certain relations, because I'm interested in these today. And so these are this is kind of the mind map of, again, relations between these times and geographies, but especially, I think, terms. It's a lot about the terms. I'm interested in epistemes, right? I'm not interested in ontology, I'm interested in epistemology. I'm not sure if that's going in the right direction. I hope
that helps. And I think there's a very sort of subtle maneuver that you're doing that is in some ways very glorious, because you start off with terms, and then I think the terms are the ones that seem to me moving for you while retaining their specificities in their origins, which I think is just beautiful. So thank you. That really does answer. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for a great question. Thank you. You said you had so many, so, you know, feel free to ask another one.
There's more in the chat also, Nelly. I don't know if you saw that.
Nope, sorry.
Quite a few question essays, I would call them. It's almost like, well, I can say that because I know him, but it's typical Peter. Instead of writing a question, he's writing an essay. I don't know, should we quickly have a look in the chat? And you want to, can you see it, Nelly?
Yeah. Am I muted? Yeah, I'm unmuted. Okay. So the first...
Peter, sorry, unless Peter wants to actually say it out.
Thanks, Maya. I just wrote it to be transparent because it's got references and structures. So this is why I thought it was transparent and helpful to write it out, but I can also speak it out or whatever, comment upon it, unless it was already read and we can already speak about it. Yeah.
No, please ask your question, Peter.
So it's a question out of two questions. It refers to the contemporary archipelagic thinking, of which obviously Glissant is consistent among the three authors, Rojo and Walcott as well. And there was this, basically there's this a volume that I'm referring to, the book on how to conceptualize the Caribbean as a space in which networks of islands are constitutive of a particular epistemology or way of thinking. This rich volume takes questions that have explored the Caribbean and expands them to a global anthropocentric framework. Now my two questions go then like this: under which paradigm or paradigm shift is such archipelagic as maverick, hacker, neo-cybernetic, as you were, I think, assuming at least, or hinting at, thinking possible, or at least relevant for the European condition of isolation in both metaphorical sense? We have isolated countries, states, languages as kind of islands. We have increasingly started reflecting the European condition as kind of this, not really archipelagic, but really kind of, you know, islands that are now floating more and more apart in this neo-nationalist phenomenology, as well as geographical sense, which means physical island states such as Cyprus, Malta, Ireland, so, you know, states on islands. So is it the shift toward this chaotic or chaoticized hybridity, or even a certain EU generic creolization that we should be working towards? By the way, this is not a question in the void, because we have been kind of setting up a forum which will try to, you know, apply archipelagic thinking onto the European social and cultural condition. It's happening on the island of Zres in Croatia during the last year. And the second kind of related question is, Glissant being a poet and a novelist, could one, or could you assume, or could you agree at least, that a there is a connection between archipelagic thinking and art thinking. With art thinking, I mean the specific way the artists epistemologically approach an issue as a question, problem, or challenge. So it's not art doing, it's art thinking, it's artistic way of thinking. Okay, and there's a little excuse for me for coming in late because my daughter hasn't had an issue, health issue, and that I'm so Europocentric in case I am. That's my input.
On mute, yeah. Wow, yeah, thank you. It seems to me that you already know maybe more than I do about these questions. No, but yeah, I'm starting with the first one. And I would be interesting to see also more about the project you said, but
project is completely starting, and we're probably looking for fellows and people like you to come over and
nice.
You know, and shine the light upon the whole thing. It's more in the stomach than in the head, you know. It's more like some really good people starting it up in the plexus, not having it there yet. So please.
Yeah, so now I lost the question, but I mean, yeah, here. Okay, so interesting. The under which paradigm shift? That's the like interesting part of the question. I think, yeah, so I think that the idea of archipelagic thinking kind of consists of many different implications. So I would say one is probably pretty simple, which would be if you think archipelagic thinking means or like an archipelagic principle, maybe let's say principle, would mean that, you know, different kinds of entities or like factors are informing a specific thing that would be a space or time, or, you know, then I think what it could mean is this kind of very post-colonial but also decolonial kind of claim, but also, yeah, argument that the local is the more important factor if you think about a specific grounding in identity or whatever, than the national, and that the local always has to be in conversation with the global. So I think that's one of the things that the archipelago implicates for me, but also for Glissant, I think. So when he speaks of the or like when he, you know, builds this thinking up, and I mean, this is like intimately linked to the concept of creolization, then I think this is about, you know, that there are lots of unpredictable factors come into contact, and it's important to think about how this contact can happen in a way that is, you know, not violent, that has a like ethical dimension or something. And so I think that's what the archipelagic thinking hints at some point. I also think that this is why, you know, the notion of opacity, for example, is so important, because it has and transports this ethical dimension. It does many other things as well, but I think that this is one of the important qualities it has. So, but I'm coming back to, yeah, under which paradigm shift is this thinking possible? Well, I think it is possible exactly because coming into contact in this world we live in is violent oftentimes. And so I think that's the shift that is happening, that requires us to think of how we can get into relation, not only with, you know, among like, I mean, of course, the extra human as well, but also any kind of relation to, like, I have to, you know, a system, or I don't know, you know, my relation to the patriarchy, for example. That's also something that I think is included in that kind of thinking. So I think,
I mean, shift away from the patriarchal, right?
Depends, right? If I want to do that, but that's
counter.
kind of the, you know, that's why I'm interested in relations, because the relation will tell me about the system as a whole. And so, yeah, that's why I kind of also try to carve it out a bit in my talk. But I mean, for me, yes, of course, I want to shift away from patriarchy, but not everyone wants that, right? So if we think of the dominant relation, or like, I mean, patriarchy is a relation as well. That's what I'm saying, I think. So the dominant, you know, way we relate to, for example, the role of the woman or whatever is through the patriarchy. It's also like a, yeah, how would you say Beziehungsweise? Like,
yeah, okay, I got it. Ich habe das verstanden.
Yeah, good. So, you know, there's this like wonderful author who's called Bini Adamczak, who wrote, for example, the book Beziehungsweise Revolution, right? And I mean, that's what it is about. We learn about, yeah, whatever, I'm repeating myself. Okay, and then so the other question was about art and archipelagic thinking, as in also structuring the, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I also think, first of all, I think that the arts or the art world, especially in the German-speaking world, and I mean, there are like certain actors that kind of push that, but have been, how do you say, like quite progressive in sorry, now my English is gone. No, yeah, well, in reading Glissant and referring to Glissant's work and so on and so forth, because apart from his kind of or like a negotiation of his work in the art world, in the German-speaking world, I think that he is quite unknown, which is to me interesting. Obviously, it's a problem of translation, especially. I mean, it was last year, I think, that there has been a project in the US where people came together and translated still missing work that was not translated into the English language. So he has produced so much text and work, and his oeuvre is just like mind-blowingly huge. I think half of that is available in English, and I think maybe, I don't know, like it's not even, you know, mentionable in a sense, what is there in the German-speaking world. And so I think because, you know, art and the art world is much more in contact with the world, they had discovered Édouard Glissant much earlier. And so that's the first thing. I also know that this concept of archipelago, yeah, has been quite important, I think, to make sense of an important part of the art world, which is the art market. So I'm not sure if that has worked very well. But as for your question, I think, you know, I'm probably repeating myself. So if you think of the archipelagic thinking as I have, you know, kind of defined it before, so this being in contact with the world and the local and the global and so on and so forth, I would say it would make much more sense to go about any kind of project in that sense, but I think that you could frame it also very differently. I'm not sure if, yeah, so maybe, I don't know, maybe your question also went into a different direction a little bit. I'm not sure.
I'm really sorry to interrupt. We have 2 more questions and we have only 15 minutes left.
Really? Oh my God.
Yeah, I know.
You're welcome to stay longer if you'd like. You're welcome to stay longer if you'd like, but I'm also aware that it's like, you know, it's then 2 hours of your time on this, and you know, there's bandwidth, you have other things to get to. So it's yeah, I think we should move to the other questions, but of course you can stay and
we can get back to it if we have more time, or we want to keep
things like a tiny addition. So I think what is very important when you engage with Glissant and think about his work and so on, I said in the talk at once, like poetic knowledge. I think this idea of a poetics is quite important here. And so as well, because you said being a poet, novelist, and so on, I think that, you know, in the arts or in the art world, or like in any kind of more experimental fields as well, there's much more potential to create something new. I mean, the word is a bit stupid, but you know, in terms of probably the original poiesis term, but you know, to create something that goes beyond or kind of, you know, differs from the ways we already know. And so I think this is what Glissant has done in a way only few people have, as someone who has been so committed to writing. Yeah.
All right. Perhaps it's also about changing the perspective, right? I mean, instead of creating something new, I just wanted to.
Yeah, new is yeah.
No, it's just about that. Also, beziehungsweise is respectively in English.
But that's not what it means.
It's not the same meaning, no, but that's how they translate. Yeah. Okay, so we have actually I just saw that we have 3 more, but let's go one by one. So Alara, I can see you raise your hand, but before you there is Sudipto, who wrote a question in the chat. But perhaps Sudipto, would you also like to speak out, or how do you feel?
Thanks, Tina. My question is really short. Hi, Nelly. Thanks for the fascinating talk. I was wondering if there's a way to think of the all-pervasive cybernetic black box and the problematic relation between the system and the environment, or like we can call the environment the world or the outside, via the dyad that you sort of posed between the belly of the boat and the open boat. And the second part of the question is that might that have something to do with what Membe speaks of as the blackening of the world? Maybe you were already sort of hinting something of this sort, but like I'm just trying to tease out more from you. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Also a fantastic question. So yeah, first of all, my feeling is that this notion of the black box is kind of like, you know, overused a lot, but in this specific question it makes a lot of sense, but it's something that, you know, it's often referred to if, like, you know, algorithms in our black box, we cannot see what they do, we don't understand how they operate, and I think it often, you know, hinders us to at least like get closer in approximation to understanding a bit more, right? I'm not arguing that we can understand everything. I do think that we live in a time where, you know, systems operate in a very complex manner, and that this is a problem. But I also think that a lot of the time it's just used to kind of like overshadow something else you don't want to really get at, or I don't know. Yeah, and so the belly of the boat and the open boat, I think, is a really, really interesting, well, imagery and also metaphor and many other things to think through in this first chapter of Poétique de la Relation. If I think of the black box as you know, well, like in its technical sense, I wouldn't immediately equate it, I think, with the belly of the boat, but I also understand that it's not what you're suggesting. You're saying that, you know, the black box as in its relation to the world and the environment. And so, yeah, I'm not sure if I would do that actually, but that's like a very personal, you know, choice, because I think for me, what is interesting about this chapter, as he framed it as the open boat, where he describes so many horrors, and, you know, actually that's where he establishes already this notion of the non-history. He establishes this kind of abyss and the opacity of what, you know, is lost at the shore and everything. And to call that the open boat, and then to kind of make that a point of departure for something evolutionary, I'm not sure if I could relate that directly to the world as such in a sense. But I do think that especially the term of opacity is, you know, especially interesting if we think about the black box and also about the black box epistemology, how, like, I don't know, Alexander Galloway, for example, has written about it as in relation to the black bloc and a certain political movement, right? And so I think to relate opacity to the black box and then to the belly of the boat, for example, would make a lot of sense, and then maybe go from there. And in terms of Mbembe and the blackening of the world, yeah, I mean, yeah, it certainly has to do with it. Yes, I think so. I think there's a difference in scale. That sounds a bit weird, but I also think that, you know, the blackening of the world. Well, I mean, yeah, I do think that they think these terms and things and images in like parallel lines. Yeah. So I would have to now expand on this majorly, but I do think it's in parallel lines. Yeah, I think that it has to do with each other. But yeah, since we don't have a lot of time, I hope this was okay for an answer. I can see there are more.
Thank you, Nelly. The next one is Alara. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Sure. Thank you very much for the fantastic talk, also for your discussions. It was truly inspiring. I'm not that familiar with Glissant's work, so it might sound, I don't know, my questions may be a bit rough, but I'm curious to connect it to his thinking or what you talked about, you know, this the view of the world as not stigmatized or you know, part of the world that might remain incomputable. I wonder whether such way of approach, his way of approaching that incomputable or unsystematized world could be a point of departure to kind of like resist the ways in which machine learning systems are increasingly computing a lot of things that might remain incomputable, if that makes sense. I don't know. I'm wondering whether like it's in your work, or do you know existing literature that uses Glissant's vocabulary, that vocabulary of incomputable, or that maybe like chaos theory, I guess, and use that to making arguments against things that should remain opaque or intransparent, if I may say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I don't know any work that actually engages with, you know, this like erratic deterministic system and chaos theory, which is why I'm doing it. But I do a lot of work. There's a lot of work, for example, on the term opacity, right? And it started also quite early. So this term has been in Glissant's work from the beginning. It's really, really amazing to explore it because it's in his novels, it's in his poetry, it's everywhere, but it takes different forms and, you know, descriptions in a way. So it starts off, like, it has a real materiality to it. So it starts off, for example, when he describes, well, nature, for example, the forest, right? He writes, the forest was the first obstacle the slave opposed to the planter. So the opacity here is the forest itself, right? That's where the resistance lies in a way. Opacity is also present when he writes about a sheet of paper, right? And then the opaque signs that will be on the opaque paper and so on and so forth. So it's there from the beginning. And then it evolves a bit, but he always comes back to this kind of, and I mean, also to refer to an opaque history, there's also materiality in that because it refers to a very specific kind of space of experience. And so, yeah. First, and so there are a lot of people who have engaged with this opacity. I think one of the most, you know, maybe known would be, I mean, there's so many, but yeah, for example, Zach Blass in that kind of field. Zach Blass wrote a dissertation on informatic opacity, and he engaged a lot with also artistic practices, right? And a lot of people, I think also that, you know, our media technical condition kind of paved the way for opacity a lot, because the idea of transparency, which is also an ideology and like a, you know, a mantra, that it is like this, I don't know, democratic idea and something that would actually provide a lot more, I don't know, freedom for people, whatever, justice. This idea has become much more virulent with the digital, but to also have in mind how transparency, or like the violence of the gaze, and the violence of, Glissant writes about this as well, right? The violence of transparency, because it will always be a tool, but also a technology of those in power to actually control those that are not in power, and so on and so forth. And so many people have written about transparency, Fanon, but of course Foucault, but like very many other people. So first, I think what I want to do in my dissertation is at some point to argue with how under our current media technological condition, it is actually about relations when I think or try to conceptualize the incomputable. The incomputable as a term is not, Glissant never used it, but I think that how I frame his work with, the scenes I picked and everything, this is a term I'm trying to contour, because I think we have to think about what it means that we live in a world that wants to compute everything, but we already also know that it is not possible to compute everything. And so it has certainly to do with thinking about this term, or thinking through this term opacity more. But I've been a bit hesitant. Like, I don't think that it captures everything that potentially is there if we think of the term of relation. I think that the term relation offers many more things that will carry us to what is the incomputable today than the term opacity. It is in there somehow, but it's not enough, I think.
Pedro also has a question to the term relation that he just posted in the chat. He also says that there's no microphone available for him right now. So perhaps, Nelly, if you could read it and then refer to it, that would be lovely.
Yeah, so I'll read it out loud. Yeah. Okay, I wanted to ask a question. That's the one, right? But my computer. So if I see a productive or generative power in understanding feedback as relation, capital relations, yeah, because one of Glissant's definitions that stays the most with me is that relation in itself is relation. So that complicates a bit the idea of a self-reinforcing system, the feedback loop, but rather would reconfigure that relationship. I'm not sure it does, but I was wondering if you have any thoughts on this. Yes. Oh, thank you. It's quite challenging to think through Glissant's term of relation, because the definition you gave here is one of those I'm working with as well, but there are many others, and I would never say that they contradict each other, but they hint at different directions, I think. So with this definition, relation in itself is relation. I think this definition is needed in order for Glissant to make relation not a totality, to explain that relation in itself is a movement, that it is flexible and it is never a state of things, because then it would be actually a totality as in the system. And so going from there, yes, I think it complicates this idea of a self-reinforcing system, but it also reinforces it in a way. So I think, it actually puts into conversation, or opens the floor for more terms, because feedback also as a principle and as a mode of operation, let's say, it hits a wall at some point, right? And then you have to start thinking about, I mean, at some point, I think you have to start thinking about time. Time is the, major factor of why specific things, or when and why specific things in a system, adapt to stuff and, things like that. And so I think if you arrive at time, you actually start thinking about, probably if you think about feedback and, a self-reinforcing system, you arrive at recursivity. That's where I arrive. And then I try to think about all of like the relations of all of these terms. So feedback, Glissant's relation, and recursivity. Yeah. But great question. It's exactly what I'm doing and trying to think through.
So many thoughts. Wow. I would love to continue forever, but I think, Maya, what do you think? Should we slowly wrap?
I kind of have to go. I'm happy for people to stay if they want to talk with Nelly. But I just wanted to say a couple of things in sort of bringing this part to a close. First of all, thank you so much for doing this, Nelly. I'm really happy that you were able to share this work, and that it's, like we were saying at the beginning, you can have some of these very intimate conversations. It's actually a very, very nice place of privilege to have someone talk about these ideas. They feel like very intimate seminars almost, but amongst people that and they're sort of comforting and comfortable spaces. As you were talking, I was so struck by how, you're kind of developing a glossary and you're building a glossary, and this is a glossary project. And I already have like a long list of things that I would love to see as like little mini things that people would write in relation to some of these words. I think the question that I have, and that maybe this is something that, I don't know, maybe you and I can write it, maybe somebody else in this group would like to write it, but the piece that was for me sort of interesting comes from this idea of feedback and the connection to questions of bias. And maybe that is your work, maybe that is the stuff you're writing about now, but I would love that perspective on it at some point. I think there were also very interesting ideas about opacity, but also fragmentation, this idea of relations and movement and recursivity, all of which, as you say, is so it's so sort of foundational to the technologies underlying artificial intelligence. So I feel like there's something very exciting you're doing here. It's really, and I'm very excited for your work to come out in the world. So if we can start inspiring you to write little bits in it, that would be great, or other people to write little bits about any of these ideas. I will come back to some of you. I think I have connections to all of you, perhaps either via social media or email. So please do stay in touch. This was really great. Thank you so much to Tina for organizing and taking care of everything. And yeah, I'm gonna end there. If anyone has any questions, please reach out to me. I think all of you know how to reach out to me in some way, shape or form. Social media pluralist.
Sorry, I just posted the email again. So
great.
Yeah, thank you also from my side to Maya for inviting me to join this really, really fascinating project. And thank you to Nelly for joining us today and putting so many thoughts in our heads that we can entangle with now for the rest of the day. And yeah, just to remind you, tomorrow there's another talk at 5 p.m. By Mouchon Ser Aviv about recalculating root. So register the same way you registered for this talk, and then you can see at least Maya and me again. I don't know about the others. And yeah, thank you so much. I think that's it for now. I think we should just get some fresh air now.
Yeah.
Yeah, also thank you from my side. Really, thank you for having me, and amazing questions, really. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nelly.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. See you. Bye. Take care.
You too.